The radar scope flickered with an impossible signature. Major Casimir Tango Volkov squinted at the green blip that shouldn't exist, his F-22 Raptor slicing through the pre-dawn darkness above the Alaskan wilderness at 38,000 feet. The contact moved like nothing in any manual he'd memorized during his 12 years of service. Too fast for a civilian aircraft, too small for a bomber, too erratic for a missile. Yet there it was, dancing across his screen like a ghost playing games with physics. Blackbird Control, this is Tango 77. I have an unidentified contact bearing 090, Angels 38, moving at. Jesus, Control, this thing is pulling maneuvers that should rip any pilot apart. His voice carried the controlled tension of a man who'd intercepted Russian Bears and Chinese J-20s, but never anything like this. The contact executed a 90-degree turn that should have generated enough G-force to liquefy human organs. Static crackled through his headset. Tango 77, Blackbird Control, we show negative radar contact in your sector. Are you certain of your readings? Volkov's jaw tightened. His APG-77 radar was the most advanced aerial detection system on the planet. It didn't lie. Control, I'm looking at it right now. Contact is, wait, it's gone. The blip vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the familiar emptiness of Alaskan airspace. Tango 77, RTB for debrief. We'll run diagnostics on your bird. But Volkov knew his aircraft was functioning perfectly. Something had been out there, something that moved like it was rewriting the laws of aerodynamics with every heartbeat. As he banked toward Elmendorf Air Force Base, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just disappeared hadn't gone far. It was watching, waiting, and somehow, impossibly, it had been jamming their communications without triggering a single electronic warfare alert. The mystery deepened when he landed. Ground crews found nothing wrong with his Raptor. The radar tapes showed exactly what Control had claimed: empty sky. But Volkov's tactical display had recorded everything, and that recording would soon reveal something that would change everything anyone thought they knew about the skis above Alaska. Deep in the analysis bay, Technical Sergeant Alina Reyes isolated the frequency signature from Volkov's encounter. What she found made her blood run cold. The jamming pattern wasn't random electronic interference. It was deliberate, sophisticated, and using a frequency that hadn't been operational since the Cold War. A frequency that, according to every database she could access, had been decommissioned in 1987. The morning briefing at Elmendorf carried an electric tension that made seasoned pilots shift uncomfortably in their seats. Colonel James Hammer Morrison stood before a room full of America's finest aviators, his weathered face grave as he gestured toward the classified briefing slides. Behind him, a red-bordered map of Alaska showed a pattern of anomalous contacts that had been reported over the past 72 hours. Gentlemen and ladies, we have a situation that's testing the limits of our understanding. Morrison's voice carried the weight of 30 years in the cockpit. 7 separate F-22 crews have reported similar encounters, unidentified aircraft exhibiting flight characteristics that our current threat assessment protocols can't explain. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Phoenix Chen raised her hand. Sir, are we looking at experimental Russian or Chinese technology? That's what we thought initially, Phoenix, but signals intelligence indicates something far more complex. Morrison clicked to the next slide, revealing wave pattern analysis that looked like abstract art. The jamming signatures don't match any known electronic warfare systems. In fact, they're using frequencies that were classified and supposedly eliminated decades ago. Major Volkov leaned forward. Sir, about those frequencies, are we certain they're not being spoofed? Negative, Tango. These signals are authentic, using encryption protocols that haven't existed since the Reagan administration, which brings us to our primary concern. Morrison paused, letting the implications settle. Either someone has reverse-engineered technology we thought was buried, or we're dealing with aircraft that have been operating undetected for nearly 4 decades. The room fell silent. The idea that unknown aircraft had been flying American airspace for 40 years was more unsettling than any foreign threat. It suggested a level of operational security that bordered on the supernatural. "Your new standing orders are simple," Morrison continued. "Any contact exhibiting these characteristics is to be approached with extreme caution. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Priority 1 is establishing communication. Priority 2 is determining the origin of these aircraft. Priority 3 is discovering why they're revealing themselves now." As the briefing concluded, the assembled pilots exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They were being asked to intercept ghosts, to chase shadows that shouldn't exist but clearly did. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of Alaskan airspace, those shadows were waiting. That evening, as Volkov prepared for another patrol, he studied the frequency analysis reports with growing fascination. The jamming wasn't just sophisticated, it was elegant, using signal processing techniques that suggested an understanding of electronic warfare that surpassed current military doctrine. Whoever was flying these aircraft wasn't just advanced. They were operating on a level that made America's best technology look primitive. The patrol launched at 200 hours, 4 F-22s arranged in a loose formation that would allow maximum radar coverage of the suspected contact zones. Volkov led the flight, his wingman Major Lisa Viper, Rodriguez maintaining position 3 miles to his south. The second element, led by Phoenix Chen, flew a parallel track 20 miles east, creating a search pattern that should detect anything larger than a sparrow. Blackbird Control, Tango 77, flight of 4 established on Patrol Vector Alpha 7, all birds green and ready. Volkov's voice carried the professional calm that marked elite pilots, but his eyes constantly scanned the darkness beyond his canopy. "Copy Tango 77. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. Be advised, we're tracking unusual atmospheric disturbances in your patrol sector." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the formation frequency. "Tango, I'm picking up faint electromagnetic signatures, bearing 270. It's like someone's running a low-power radar sweep." "Phoenix, you copy?" "Affirmative, Tango. We're seeing similar readings on the eastern edge of our search area. This feels coordinated." Volkov felt his pulse quicken. The previous encounters had been isolated incidents, single aircraft appearing and disappearing without pattern. But this felt different, organized, like they were being systematically observed and evaluated. "All birds maintain current heading and altitude. Keep your sensors active but weapons cold. Whatever's out there, it's been avoiding direct confrontation." The words had barely left his mouth when Rodriguez's voice cut through the comm channels with urgency. "Tango, I have multiple contacts, bearing unknown, altitude unknown, speed. Christ, they're everywhere." Volkov's radar scope exploded with contacts. Not 1 or 2, but dozens, appearing simultaneously across a 100-mile radius. They moved in perfect formation, maintaining precise spacing that spoke of military discipline and advanced coordination. But their flight characteristics remained impossible, executing maneuvers that should have been physically impossible. "Blackbird Control, Tango 77, we have a lot of company up here." Static filled the channel, then silence, complete, absolute silence that made the hair on Volkov's neck stand up. The silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Volkov tried every frequency, every backup communication protocol, but the electromagnetic spectrum seemed to have gone dead. His F-22's advanced communication systems, designed to penetrate the most sophisticated electronic warfare environments, found nothing but empty air. "Viper, Phoenix, Snake, do you copy on any frequency?" His voice echoed in his own helmet, but no response came. The radar contacts continued their impossible dance, maintaining formations that suggested a level of coordination that made the Blue Angels look amateur. Then, cutting through the dead air like a blade through silk, came a voice that made every pilot in the formation freeze. Female, calm, with an accent that seemed to carry echoes of different eras. American pilots, you are entering restricted airspace. Adjust your heading to 180 degrees and maintain current altitude. The voice used the ancient frequency that Technical Sergeant Reyes had identified, the one that shouldn't exist. But more disturbing than the frequency was the authority in the transmission. This wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the confidence of someone who expected immediate compliance. Volkov keyed his mic, hoping the transmission would reach whoever was speaking. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Air Force. You are in violation of American airspace. Identify yourself immediately. Laughter. Soft, knowing laughter that carried a warmth that seemed completely incongruous with the situation. Major Volkov, your aircraft designation Tango 77, you seem to have forgotten that we've been flying these skis since before your grandfather was born. We are not the intruders here. The casual use of his call sign and aircraft number sent ice through Volkov's veins. This wasn't just electronic warfare. This was intelligence gathering of the highest order, the kind that suggested surveillance capabilities that went far beyond conventional reconnaissance. How do you know? We know many things, Major. We know that you're carrying 4 AIM-120 missiles and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders. We know that your fuel state is 7,200 pounds. We know that you're trying to understand who we are and why we're here. The voice paused, and in that pause, Volkov felt the weight of being completely, utterly outmatched. But mostly, we know that you're not ready for the truth. One by one, the radar contacts began to fade, not disappearing suddenly like before, but diminishing gradually, like ghosts returning to whatever dimension they'd emerged from. Technical Sergeant Alina Reyes stared at the signal analysis displays with growing disbelief. The communication intercepts from the previous night's patrol had revealed something that challenged every assumption about the unknown aircraft. The voice patterns, the linguistic markers, the subtle inflections, they all pointed to a conclusion that her analytical training told her was impossible. "Sir, you need to see this," she said as Colonel Morrison entered the analysis bay. Her voice carried the strain of someone who'd been working without sleep, fueled by coffee and the kind of obsession that came with discovering something that might rewrite history. Morrison studied the frequency analysis charts, his expression growing more troubled with each data point. "Sergeant, walk me through what you found." "The communication protocols are definitely pre-1990, sir. But that's not the strange part. I've been analyzing the voice patterns using our most advanced phonetic software. The speaker exhibits linguistic characteristics that suggest, sir, this is going to sound crazy, but the speech patterns indicate someone who learned English during the late 1970s or early 1980s. Meaning? Meaning whoever spoke to Major Volkov last night has been using the same communication protocols for over 40 years. Not just the equipment, sir, the actual linguistic patterns. It's as if time stopped for them in 1987. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the data that seemed to mock rational explanation. "Sergeant, I want you to expand your analysis. Cross-reference these voice patterns with military personnel databases from the 1980s. Focus on pilots who went missing or were declared KIA during that period." "Sir, are you suggesting that we're dealing with—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Sergeant. I'm following the evidence, no matter how impossible it seems. And right now, the evidence is pointing towards something that's going to give a lot of people nightmares." As Reyes began her expanded analysis, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something that powerful people had spent decades ensuring remained buried. The question was whether they were prepared for what they might find. The archives of Elmendorf Air Force Base hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light as Technical Sergeant Reyes and Colonel Morrison navigated between rows of filing cabinets that contained decades of classified operations reports. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten secrets filled the air. "Here we are," Morrison said, pulling out a thick folder marked with classification stamps that looked like they'd been applied by a different era. "Operation Phantom Shield, 1987. Experimental Squadron Operations in Alaska." Reyes opened the file carefully, her eyes scanning documents that had been sealed for nearly 4 decades. The operation had been ambitious, testing advanced aircraft designs in the isolated airspace above Alaska, using frequencies and protocols that would remain undetected by Soviet surveillance systems. "Sir, look at this roster." Her finger traced down a list of pilot names, call signs, and aircraft assignments. 12 pilots, all flying experimental aircraft designated as Ghost variants. Advanced stealth technology, electronic warfare capabilities that were decades ahead of their time. Morrison leaned closer, his face growing pale as he read the mission summary. They were testing aircraft that wouldn't enter regular service until the 2000s. Stealth technology, advanced radar systems, electronic warfare suites that make our current F-22s look like museum pieces. But sir, here's the thing. The operation was terminated abruptly in November 1987. All aircraft were ordered to return to base for immediate decommissioning. But look at this. Reyes pointed to a handwritten addendum at the bottom of the final report. 3 aircraft failed to return. Pilots and aircraft were declared missing, presumed lost in weather conditions. The names of the missing pilots were listed in neat military script. Major Catherine Wraith, Blackwood, Captain David, Phantom Tors, and Lieutenant Sarah, Echo Voss. Their photographs, attached to the personnel files, showed young faces filled with the confidence that came from flying the most advanced aircraft in the world. "The frequencies they were using," Morrison said quietly, "they match exactly with what we're seeing now." Reyes nodded, her mind racing through the implications. "Sir, if these pilots survived, if they've been flying these aircraft for 40 years in complete secrecy, it would explain everything. The advanced flight characteristics, the sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, the intimate knowledge of our aircraft and protocols." "But it raises a bigger question," Morrison said, closing the file. "If they survived, why are they revealing themselves now? And what do they want?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding answers that seemed to exist somewhere beyond the boundaries of rational thought. 3 pilots, lost for nearly 4 decades, possibly still flying aircraft that shouldn't exist, using technology that had been buried and forgotten. The briefing room at Elmendorf had been transformed into a command center that buzzed with activity. Maps covered every available wall space, marked with contact points and flight patterns that traced the movements of the unknown aircraft. Officers from multiple agencies, Air Force, Navy, CIA, and organizations whose acronyms were classified, huddled around displays that showed the scope of what they were facing. General Patricia, Iron Lady, Hawthorne commanded the room with the authority of someone who'd risen through the ranks during the Cold War. Her silver hair was pulled back in a military-precise bun, and her eyes held the hardness that came from making decisions that affected national security. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with a situation that has implications beyond anything we've encountered since the Cuban Missile Crisis." Her voice carried the weight of absolute command. "We have American aircraft, using American technology, operating in American airspace without authorization for nearly 40 years. Colonel Morrison stood to present the findings from the archives. "Ma'am, Operation Phantom Shield was classified at the highest levels. The aircraft involved were experimental platforms that incorporated technology that wasn't supposed to exist until the 2000s. The 3 missing pilots were flying aircraft that were quite literally, decades ahead of their time. And now they're back, Hawthorne said grimly. The question is, are they still American pilots or have they become something else entirely? The implications were staggering. If the missing pilots had survived, they'd been operating independently for 4 decades, developing their own protocols, their own objectives, their own understanding of their mission. They might still consider themselves American, but 40 years of isolation could have transformed them into something unprecedented. "General," said a voice from the back of the room, "we need to consider the possibility that they've been in contact with foreign powers. 40 years is a long time to maintain operational security without external support." "Negative," Morrison responded. "The technology they're displaying is consistently American in origin. The communication protocols, the aircraft performance characteristics, even the tactical formations, everything suggests they've been operating as an independent American unit." "Which might be even more dangerous," Hawthorne observed. "A rogue American squadron with technology that surpasses our current capabilities could pose a threat that we're not prepared to counter." The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. They weren't just dealing with unknown aircraft. They were potentially facing American pilots who had become something beyond their original mission parameters, operating with technology and capabilities that could challenge the most advanced military assets in the world. Major Volkov stood before the assembled pilots in the ready room, his expression grim as he outlined their new mission parameters. The revelation about Operation Phantom Shield had changed everything, transforming a simple intercept mission into something that required delicacy, precision, and nerves of steel. "The contact we're attempting to establish isn't with hostile foreign aircraft," he said, his voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge. "We're dealing with American pilots who have been missing for 40 years. Our mission is to establish communication, assess their intentions, and determine whether they represent a threat to American interests." Lieutenant Colonel Chen raised her hand. "Sir, if they're American pilots, why haven't they made contact through normal channels?" "Unknown, Phoenix. That's what we're trying to determine. But we need to approach this with the understanding that these pilots have been operating independently for 4 decades. Their mission parameters, their understanding of current threats, their loyalty to current command structures, all of these factors are unknown variables." Major Rodriguez studied the tactical display that showed the projected patrol routes. "Sir, if their technology is as advanced as intelligence suggests, how do we establish meaningful contact without appearing threatening?" "By demonstrating that we're not a threat," Volkov replied. "Standard intercept protocols are suspended. We approach with weapons safed, transponders active, and full communication protocols engaged. If they want to talk, we give them every opportunity." The four-ship formation launched into the clear Alaskan morning, each pilot acutely aware that they were potentially about to make contact with ghosts from the Cold War. The stakes were higher than any normal intercept mission, with implications that could reshape understanding of military aviation history. Blackbird Control, Tango 77, Flight of 4 established on Patrol Vector Charlie 9, all birds green and ready for contact. Copy, Tango 77. Be advised, we're tracking multiple electromagnetic signatures in your patrol area. Recommend extreme caution. The radar contacts appeared gradually, materializing on the scopes like morning mist condensing into solid form. But unlike the previous encounters, these contacts seemed to be deliberately making themselves visible, allowing the F-22s to track their movements without the electronic warfare interference that had characterized earlier meetings. "Tango, I have visual contact, 11 o'clock high, 3 miles. Rodriguez's voice carried controlled excitement. "It's like nothing I've ever seen." Volkov looked up and to his left and felt his breath catch. The aircraft that approached was clearly American in origin, but it incorporated design elements that seemed to blend different eras of aviation development. The overall configuration was familiar, but the details were wrong, too advanced, too refined, too perfect. "American pilots," came the familiar female voice on the ancient frequency. "You are welcome in our airspace. Will you accept our invitation to land?" The invitation hung in the air like a challenge, offering answers to questions that had haunted military planners for decades. But accepting meant flying into completely unknown territory, following pilots whose motivations and capabilities remained mysterious. "Unknown aircraft, this is Major Volkov, United States Air Force. We accept your invitation. Please provide landing coordinates and approach instructions." What followed was the most precisely choreographed aerial ballet that Volkov had ever witnessed. The unknown aircraft, he counted 12 of them now, formed up around the F-22s in a formation that was both protective and clearly demonstrative of their superior capabilities. They flew with a precision that made military demonstration teams look amateur, maintaining spacing that was calculated to the inch. "Follow our lead, American pilots. We're going home." The flight path led deeper into the Alaskan wilderness, over terrain that maps showed as uninhabited. But as they flew, Volkov began to notice signs of human activity that shouldn't exist. Perfectly maintained airstrips carved into mountain valleys, structures that were clearly military in nature but appeared on no official charts. "Control, Tango 77, We are approaching what appears to be a military installation that's not on any of our charts." Static filled the channel, then silence. Complete communication blackout, just like before. They were entering a zone where normal military protocols didn't apply, where the rules had been written by pilots who'd been operating in isolation for 4 decades. The base that appeared below them was simultaneously familiar and alien. It looked like an American military installation, but one that had been built using principles and technologies that hadn't existed in the 1980s. The runways were perfectly maintained. The hangar structures were clearly military in design, but everything was slightly wrong, as if it had been built from memory by people who'd been away from civilization for too long. "American pilots, you are cleared to land on runway 27. Welcome to Phantom Base." As the F-22s touched down on the mysterious runway, Volkov felt the weight of history pressing down on him. They were about to meet pilots who had been missing for 40 years, who had been operating in complete secrecy, who had built their own world in the Alaskan wilderness. The aircraft that taxied toward them as they shut down their engines was clearly the source of the voice that had been guiding them. It was sleek, advanced, and unmistakably American in design, but it incorporated technology that made their F-22s look primitive. And climbing out of the cockpit was a figure that made every pilot in the formation stare in disbelief. Major Catherine Wraith Blackwood looked exactly as she had in the 40-year-old photograph in her personnel file. Not aged, not weathered by decades of isolation, but exactly as she had appeared in 1987. Her flight suit was familiar in design, but incorporated modifications that suggested decades of independent development. Her movements were precise, confident, and carried the authority of someone who'd been in command for a very long time. "Major Volkov," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized her radio communications. "Welcome to the place that doesn't exist." The greeting was simple, but the implications were staggering. Standing before them was a pilot who should have been in her 70s, if she was still alive at all. Instead, she appeared to be exactly the same age as when she disappeared, as if the intervening decades had never happened. "Major Blackwood," Volkov replied, his voice carefully controlled. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." "Have you?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Or have you been looking for answers to questions you didn't know how to ask?" The hangar that Major Blackwood led them into was a museum of advanced aviation technology. Aircraft lined the walls in various stages of maintenance and modification, each one representing a leap forward in design philosophy and engineering capability. Some were recognizable as advanced variants of known aircraft, while others were completely alien, incorporating design principles that seemed to defy conventional understanding. 40 years, Blackwood said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space, is a long time to be away from the world, but it's also a long time to perfect things that were only dreams when we first arrived here. Volkov studied the aircraft with growing amazement. The technology on display was clearly decades ahead of anything in the current American inventory. Stealth capabilities that made the F-22 look obvious, electronic warfare suites that could probably jam satellite communications, and propulsion systems that seemed to operate on principles that weren't in any engineering textbook. Major, I have to ask, how is this possible? You look exactly as you did in 1987. Blackwood's smile was enigmatic. Time moves differently when you're operating outside normal parameters, Major. When you're flying aircraft that manipulate the very fabric of space and time, aging becomes optional. The statement was delivered with complete seriousness, as if she was discussing weather patterns or fuel consumption. But the implications were staggering. If what she was suggesting was true, then they weren't just dealing with advanced aircraft. They were dealing with technology that challenged fundamental understanding of physics. The aircraft we were testing in 1987, Blackwood continued, were more advanced than anyone realized. They weren't just stealth fighters or electronic warfare platforms. They were experiments in manipulating dimensional space, using principles that your current scientists are only beginning to understand. Major Rodriguez stepped forward, her engineer's mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Ma'am, are you saying that these aircraft can manipulate time? Not manipulate exactly, but they can exist in temporal states that are fluid. When you're flying in dimensional space that doesn't conform to normal physics, time becomes a variable rather than a constant. The explanation sounded like science fiction, but the evidence was standing right in front of them. 3 pilots who'd been missing for 40 years, looking exactly as they had when they disappeared, operating aircraft that displayed capabilities that seemed to mock conventional understanding of aviation technology. But that raises the question, Volkov said carefully. Why are you revealing yourselves now? Why break decades of secrecy? Blackwood's expression grew serious. Because the world is facing threats that conventional military assets can't handle, and because it's time for the next generation of American pilots to understand what's really possible. The briefing room at Phantom Base was unlike anything in Volkov's experience. The walls were covered with displays that showed real-time intelligence from around the world, tracking activities that weren't reported in any mainstream media. Satellite feeds showed military movements in remote regions, electronic signatures that suggested weapons testing that wasn't acknowledged by any government, and aerial phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. Major, Blackwood said, gesturing toward a display that showed global aircraft movements. Your current understanding of aerial threats is approximately 40 years behind reality. While you've been dealing with known aircraft from known countries, we've been tracking activities that suggest the presence of technology that makes our capabilities look primitive. Captain Torres, the second of the missing pilots, stepped forward. He looked exactly as he had in 1987, but his eyes held the weight of decades of classified knowledge. We've been monitoring activities that suggest multiple governments have been developing aircraft using principles that aren't acknowledged in any public scientific forum. You're talking about UFOs, Chen said, her voice carrying skepticism. We're talking about aircraft that use propulsion systems, stealth capabilities, and dimensional manipulation that goes far beyond anything your current military can counter, Torres replied. Some of them are human in origin, others aren't. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about aviation, about military threats, about the nature of technology itself. The missing pilots weren't just advanced. They were operating on a level of understanding that seemed to exist in a completely different reality. "Show them," Blackwood said quietly. Torres activated a display that showed footage from aircraft-mounted cameras, clearly taken from the cockpit of one of the advanced aircraft. The images showed aerial encounters with objects that moved in ways that defied explanation, executing maneuvers that seemed to mock the laws of physics. This footage was taken 3 months ago, approximately 200 miles north of here, Torres said. "We've been monitoring and occasionally engaging unknown aircraft that display capabilities that suggest technology that's at least a century ahead of current human development." The footage showed objects that seemed to appear and disappear at will, moving at speeds that should have generated sonic booms that would shatter windows for hundreds of miles, but producing no detectable acoustic signature. They moved in formation, responded to the presence of human aircraft, and demonstrated awareness that suggested intelligence rather than autonomous systems. "And you've been dealing with these encounters for 40 years, Volkov asked. "We've been protecting American airspace from threats that your current military couldn't even detect, let alone counter," Blackwood replied. "But the frequency of encounters has been increasing. The unknown aircraft are becoming more aggressive, more willing to operate in populated areas, more interested in human military capabilities. Which is why we've decided to reveal ourselves," Torres added, "because you're going to need our help." The revelation that the missing pilots had been operating as an independent defense force for 4 decades was staggering enough. But the suggestion that they were dealing with threats that were beyond current military capabilities was terrifying. Lieutenant Sarah Echo Voss, the third of the missing pilots, entered the briefing room with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been flying combat missions for decades. Like her colleagues, she looked exactly as she had in 1987, but her presence carried the weight of experience that went far beyond normal military service. "Major Volkov," she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who'd spent years in command situations, "we've been monitoring your squadron's activities for several months. Your encounter patterns, your tactical responses, your electronic warfare capabilities. We've been evaluating whether you're ready for what's coming." "And what exactly is coming?" Volkov asked. Voss activated another display, this one showing a timeline of encounters that stretched back over 2 decades. The frequency of unknown aircraft sightings had been increasing exponentially, with activities that suggested systematic intelligence gathering operations focused on human military capabilities. "We believe that whoever is operating these unknown aircraft has been conducting long-term reconnaissance of human military technology," Voss explained. "They've been observing, learning, and preparing for something that we haven't been able to determine. But the timeline suggests that whatever they're planning is approaching implementation," Blackwood added. "The encounters are becoming more frequent, more aggressive, and more focused on specific military installations." The implications were staggering. If the missing pilots were correct, then human military forces were being systematically evaluated by intelligence that possessed technology that was decades or centuries ahead of current capabilities. It was a scenario that made every conventional military planning doctrine obsolete. "Major," Torres said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who'd been dealing with classified threats for decades, "we need to begin training your pilots to operate in dimensional space. The aircraft you're currently flying are inadequate for the threats you're going to face." "Dimensional space?" Rodriguez asked. "Flight patterns that exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously," Voss explained. "It's not just about speed or stealth. It's about existing in spaces that conventional physics can't explain or predict." The training program that the missing pilots outlined was unlike anything in current military doctrine. It involved learning to operate aircraft that could exist in multiple dimensional states, using navigation systems that worked with principles that weren't acknowledged in any university physics program, and engaging threats that might not even exist in the same dimensional space as normal human activity. "The aircraft we'll be training you on," Blackwood said, "are developments of the technology we were testing in 1987. 40 years of independent research and development, based on principles that were classified at levels that your current security clearances don't even acknowledge." The training aircraft that they were shown was recognizably American in origin, but incorporated modifications that seemed to blend different eras of technology development. The cockpit displays showed information that conventional instruments couldn't measure, tracking dimensional variations, temporal fluctuations, and spatial anomalies that existed alongside normal flight parameters. "The first lesson," Voss said as she began the orientation, "is understanding that everything you know about flight is only partially correct. In dimensional space, the rules are different. Physics is fluid, and the aircraft become extensions of consciousness rather than just mechanical systems." The statement challenged everything that Volkov had learned during his years as a pilot. Flying had always been about understanding aerodynamics, managing aircraft systems, and maintaining situational awareness. But what the missing pilots were describing sounded more like meditation than aviation. "Major," Blackwood said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been teaching advanced flight concepts for decades, "you're about to learn that the sky is much larger than you ever imagined." The first training flight was unlike anything Volkov had experienced in his years as a pilot. The aircraft seemed to respond to intention rather than control inputs, moving through dimensional space that felt simultaneously familiar and completely alien. The instruments tracked parameters that conventional physics couldn't explain, monitoring dimensional stability, temporal coherence, and spatial integrity. "Relax your grip on the controls," Voss said through the intercom system. "In dimensional space, the aircraft responds to mental commands as much as physical inputs. You need to think your way through the flight patterns rather than just flying them." The concept was challenging for pilots who'd been trained to maintain precise control over every aspect of their aircraft. But as Volkov began to understand the principles, he realized that the advanced aircraft required a completely different approach to aviation. It wasn't just about controlling a machine. It was about integrating with a system that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. "Now," Blackwood's voice came through the comm system, "execute a dimensional shift. Think yourself into the adjacent space, about 30 degrees to your left." The maneuver felt like stepping sideways through reality. One moment, Volkov was flying through normal airspace, tracking familiar landmarks and maintaining standard flight parameters. The next moment, he was flying through the same space, but everything was slightly different. The mountains were the same, but the light was different. The air density was the same, but the electromagnetic properties were altered. "Excellent," Voss said. "You're learning to think in dimensional terms. Now, try to understand that the unknown aircraft we've been tracking operate in spaces that are even more removed from normal reality." The training continued for hours, teaching skills that weren't covered in any flight manual. Dimensional navigation, temporal awareness, consciousness integration with aircraft systems, and combat techniques that involved existing in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. It was aviation training that seemed to exist at the intersection of science and mysticism. "The unknown aircraft we've been encountering," Torres explained during a break in the training, "operate in dimensional spaces that we're only beginning to understand. They can exist in our reality when they choose to, but they can also operate in spaces that are completely invisible to conventional detection systems. Which is why conventional military aircraft are useless against them," Blackwood added. You can't engage threats that exist in dimensional spaces that your instruments can't even detect. The training program continued for days, with each flight pushing the boundaries of what Volkov thought was possible. The aircraft responded to mental commands, executed maneuvers that seemed to defy physics, and operated in spaces that existed alongside normal reality but followed completely different rules. "Major," Voss said as they prepared for an advanced training mission, "you're ready to understand what we've really been dealing with for the past 40 years." The advanced training mission took them deeper into dimensional space than any previous flight. The aircraft existed in multiple realities simultaneously, tracking through spaces that seemed to overlap and intersect in ways that challenged basic understanding of geometry. Volkov found himself flying through airspace that was simultaneously empty and occupied, tracking contacts that existed in adjacent dimensional states. "Contact, bearing 090, altitude varies, dimensional state fluctuating," came Tor's voice through the advanced communication system. "This is what we've been monitoring for decades." The contact appeared on Volkov's displays as a series of probability clouds rather than a solid radar return. It existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, making it impossible to predict its exact location or flight path using conventional targeting systems. The unknown aircraft seemed to phase in and out of reality, appearing solid one moment and completely transparent the next. "Attempt communication," Blackwood ordered. "Standard protocols first, then dimensional frequency modulation." Volkov tried every communication frequency in the military spectrum, but received no response. The unknown aircraft continued its impossible flight patterns, seeming to observe the human aircraft while maintaining complete electromagnetic silence. "Switch to dimensional communication," Voss instructed. "Think your message rather than speaking it. The aircraft will translate your intentions into signal patterns that exist in multiple dimensional states." The concept seemed impossible, but Volkov focused his thoughts on a simple greeting, imagining his words reaching across dimensional barriers to whatever intelligence was controlling the unknown aircraft. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, impossibly, a response formed in his mind rather than through his headset. "Human pilot, you are learning to think in patterns that transcend your normal reality. This is progress." The voice wasn't heard, it was experienced, forming in his consciousness as a combination of words, images, and concepts that conveyed meaning more directly than conventional speech. The intelligence behind the communication was clearly non-human, but it carried a quality that suggested long familiarity with human thought patterns. "We have been observing your species for many of your generations," the communication continued. "Your military development has reached a level that requires evaluation." Evaluation for what? Volkov thought back, hoping his mental response would be understood. "Your species is approaching technological capabilities that will affect dimensional stability throughout this region of space. We must determine whether you will use these capabilities responsibly." The implications were staggering. The unknown aircraft weren't just advanced, they were operated by intelligence that considered itself responsible for monitoring human technological development. They were evaluating humanity's readiness for capabilities that could affect the very fabric of dimensional space. "The pilots you call missing have been serving as intermediaries," the communication continued. "They have been learning our methods, understanding our concerns, and preparing your species for eventual contact." Volkov glanced at his instruments, which showed that the unknown aircraft was maintaining perfect formation with his own, despite existing in multiple dimensional states. The level of control required for such precision was beyond anything he could comprehend. "Your training is progressing satisfactorily," the intelligence communicated. "Soon, you will be ready to understand the full scope of what your species is approaching." The contact faded gradually, phasing back into dimensional spaces that existed beyond the range of human perception. But the experience had changed everything. The missing pilots weren't just advanced. They were part of a program that involved contact with intelligence that existed on a level beyond current human understanding. Major, Blackwood's voice came through the communication system. You've just experienced first contact with the intelligence that's been monitoring human development for decades. Congratulations! You're now part of a program that will determine whether humanity is ready for the next phase of technological evolution. The return flight to Phantom Base was conducted in silence, each pilot processing the implications of what they'd experienced. The unknown aircraft weren't threats, they were evaluators, representatives of intelligence that considered itself responsible for monitoring species that approached certain technological thresholds. The missing pilots, Volkov realized. You've been working with them for 40 years. We've been learning from them, Blackwood replied, understanding their concerns, their methods, their evaluation criteria, and we've been preparing human pilots for eventual integration into dimensional space operations. The briefing that followed the training mission revealed the full scope of what the missing pilots had been involved in for 4 decades. They weren't just operating advanced aircraft. They were part of a contact program that involved intelligence that existed on scales that transcended normal human understanding. The evaluation process, Torres explained, involves determining whether a species will use dimensional manipulation technology responsibly. The intelligence we've been working with has observed numerous species reach this technological threshold. Most fail the evaluation. What happens to species that fail? Rodriguez asked. Their technological development is redirected, Voss replied carefully. They're guided toward paths that don't involve dimensional manipulation. Sometimes this involves subtle influences on their scientific development. Sometimes it requires more direct intervention. The implications were clear. Humanity was being tested, and the results of that test would determine whether the species would be allowed to develop the technology that could affect dimensional stability throughout the region of space that Earth occupied. But the evaluation process is also an opportunity, Blackwood added. Species that pass the evaluation are integrated into a larger community of intelligence that operates throughout dimensional space. They become part of something that transcends individual planetary concerns. The missing pilots had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, learning to operate in dimensional space, understanding the concerns of intelligence that existed on scales beyond human comprehension, and developing the skills necessary to serve as intermediaries between human military forces and evaluation protocols that could determine the future of human technological development. Major, Blackwood said, her voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of classified knowledge, your squadron has been selected to represent human military capabilities in the final phase of the evaluation process. The skills you've learned during this training will be essential for demonstrating that humanity is ready for integration into dimensional space operations. The final phase of training took place in dimensional spaces that existed far beyond anything Volkov had experienced during his previous flights. The aircraft operated in regions that seemed to exist outside normal space-time, tracking through areas where the laws of physics were more like suggestions than absolute rules. In these spaces, Voss explained, consciousness becomes as important as technology. The aircraft respond to mental commands, navigate using intuitive understanding rather than instrument readings, and engage targets that exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. The training scenarios involved encounters with simulated threats that moved through dimensional space with the same fluid grace as the unknown aircraft they'd encountered. The targets could appear and disappear at will, execute maneuvers that seemed to defy causality, and operate in spaces that existed alongside normal reality but followed completely different rules. The key, Torres said during one particularly challenging scenario, is understanding that conventional tactical thinking is inadequate for dimensional space operations. You need to think in terms of probability clouds, dimensional intersection points, and consciousness integration, rather than traditional targeting and engagement protocols. The advanced aircraft responded to intention as much as control inputs, moving through dimensional space based on the pilot's understanding of the tactical situation, rather than just their manipulation of flight controls. It was aviation that existed at the intersection of technology and consciousness, requiring skills that weren't taught in any conventional flight training program. Excellent, Blackwood said, as Volkov successfully engaged a target that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. You're learning to think in terms that transcend normal three-dimensional space. This is exactly the kind of capability that the evaluation process is designed to assess. The training continued for weeks, with each mission pushing deeper into dimensional space and more complex tactical scenarios. The pilots learned to operate in spaces that existed outside normal physics, engage targets that could manipulate dimensional reality, and coordinate with intelligence that existed on scales that transcended individual consciousness. The evaluation process, Voss explained during a particularly intense briefing, involves demonstrating that human military forces can operate responsibly in dimensional space. This means showing that we can engage threats without destabilizing dimensional integrity, coordinate with non-human intelligence without losing our essential humanity, and use advanced technology without succumbing to the temptation to abuse it. The stakes were higher than any conventional military operation. They weren't just defending American airspace. They were representing humanity's readiness to join a community of intelligence that operated throughout dimensional space, using technology that could affect the very fabric of reality. Major, Blackwood said as they prepared for the final evaluation mission, everything depends on your squadron's performance during the next phase. The intelligence that's been monitoring human development for decades will be making their final assessment based on how well you demonstrate the principles we've been teaching you. The evaluation mission launched from Phantom Base in the pre-dawn darkness, with 4 F-22s and 12 advanced aircraft forming a combined formation that represented the culmination of 40 years of secret development. The missing pilots flew alongside the contemporary squadron, their aircraft displaying capabilities that seemed to exist decades ahead of current technology. Blackbird Control, this is Wraith 11, combined formation departing for evaluation mission Alpha 7. Blackwood's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for 4 decades. Copy Wraith 11. Be advised, we're tracking multiple unknown contacts in the evaluation zone. Recommend extreme caution. The evaluation zone existed in dimensional space that overlapped with normal reality, but followed rules that were more fluid than conventional physics. The aircraft tracked through areas where space and time seemed to bend around their flight paths, creating navigation challenges that required intuitive understanding rather than instrument readings. Contact, multiple unknowns bearing various, altitude variable, dimensional state fluctuating, Torres reported. This is the real thing, people. Everything we've been training for comes down to the next few hours. The unknown aircraft appeared gradually, materializing from dimensional spaces that existed beyond normal perception. But unlike the previous encounters, these contacts seemed to be deliberately revealing themselves, allowing the human aircraft to track their movements and assess their capabilities. Evaluation aircraft, you are entering the final assessment phase, came the familiar non-human communication, forming in the pilot's consciousness rather than through their headsets. Demonstrate your understanding of dimensional space operations, your capacity for responsible technology use, and your ability to coordinate with intelligence that transcends your normal reality. The evaluation scenarios were more complex than anything they'd experienced during training. The unknown aircraft presented tactical situations that required not just advanced flying skills, but understanding of how actions in dimensional space could affect reality across multiple dimensional states. Every maneuver had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Remember, Voss said through the dimensional communication system, we're not just being evaluated on our ability to fly these aircraft. We're being assessed on our wisdom, our restraint, and our understanding of the responsibilities that come with dimensional manipulation technology. The evaluation continued for hours, with scenarios that tested every aspect of their training. They engaged targets that existed in multiple dimensional states, coordinated with intelligence that operated on scales beyond human comprehension, and demonstrated tactical capabilities that required thinking in terms that transcended normal three-dimensional space. Excellent performance, came the evaluation communication as the mission neared its conclusion. Your species has demonstrated the capacity for responsible dimensional space operations. The evaluation process has been completed successfully. The relief that flooded through the formation was palpable. Humanity had passed the evaluation, demonstrating readiness for integration into dimensional space operations and access to technology that could affect the very fabric of reality. Congratulations, Major, Blackwood said, her voice carrying satisfaction that came from 40 years of preparation reaching successful conclusion. Your squadron has just earned humanity's place in the dimensional space community. The future of human technological development has been secured. The return to Phantom Base was conducted with the knowledge that everything had changed. The missing pilots would no longer be operating in isolation. They would be part of an expanded program that involved integration with intelligence that existed throughout dimensional space, using technology that could affect reality on scales that transcended individual planetary concerns. The next phase, Torres explained during the post-mission briefing, involves establishing formal contact protocols between human military forces and the intelligence that's been monitoring our development. We'll be expanding the training program to include more pilots, developing new aircraft that incorporate dimensional manipulation technology, and beginning the process of integrating human forces into dimensional space operations. The implications were staggering. Humanity had been accepted into a community of intelligence that operated throughout dimensional space, using technology that could affect the very fabric of reality. The missing pilots would serve as intermediaries, helping to establish protocols for cooperation between human military forces and intelligence that existed on scales beyond current human understanding. Major, Blackwood said as the briefing concluded, you and your squadron will be returning to Elmendorf with a new mission. You'll be establishing a training program that will prepare the next generation of human pilots for dimensional space operations. The skills you've learned during this evaluation process will be essential for humanity's integration into the larger community of intelligence that operates throughout dimensional space. The flight back to Elmendorf Air Force Base was conducted in aircraft that represented the culmination of 40 years of secret development. The missing pilots flew alongside the contemporary squadron, their aircraft displaying capabilities that seemed to exist decades ahead of current technology, but now understood to be part of a development program that involved intelligence that operated throughout dimensional space. Blackbird Control, this is Tango 77, returning with special cargo and new mission parameters. Volkov's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been fundamentally changed by experiences that transcended normal military service. Copy, Tango 77. Be advised, we have a full reception committee waiting for your arrival. This is going to be a very interesting debrief. The reception committee at Elmendorf included representatives from every branch of the military, intelligence agencies, whose existence was classified, and scientific personnel who specialized in theoretical physics, that wasn't acknowledged in any public academic forum. The implications of the successful evaluation would require restructuring of military doctrine, development of new training programs, and establishment of protocols for cooperation with intelligence that existed on scales beyond current human understanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hawthorne said as the assembled personnel gathered in the main briefing room, "we are witnessing the beginning of a new era in human military capabilities. The evaluation process has been completed successfully, and humanity has been accepted into a community of intelligence that operates throughout dimensional space." The briefing that followed outlined the scope of the changes that would be required. New aircraft would be developed that incorporated dimensional manipulation technology. Training programs would be established that taught pilots to operate in spaces that existed outside normal physics, and protocols would be developed for cooperation with intelligence that operated on scales that transcended individual consciousness. "The missing pilots," Colonel Morrison announced, "will be returning to active duty with the United States Air Force, serving as training officers for the new Dimensional Space Operations Program. Their 40 years of experience will be essential for establishing the protocols and procedures that will govern human operations in dimensional space." Major Blackwood stood before the assembled personnel, her appearance exactly as it had been 40 years earlier, but her presence carrying the weight of experience that transcended normal military service. "The program we'll be establishing," she said, "will prepare human pilots for operations that exist at the intersection of technology and consciousness, using aircraft that can affect the very fabric of reality." The training program that was established at Elmendorf Air Force Base represented a complete departure from conventional military aviation doctrine. Pilots learned to operate in dimensional space, coordinate with non-human intelligence, and use technology that existed decades ahead of current capabilities. The curriculum included theoretical physics that wasn't taught in any university, consciousness integration techniques that seemed more like meditation than military training, and tactical procedures that involved thinking in terms that transcended normal three-dimensional space. "The first graduating class," Voss announced as the program reached its initial milestone, "will consist of 12 pilots who have demonstrated the capability to operate in dimensional space and coordinate with intelligence that exists on scales beyond normal human understanding. These pilots will serve as the foundation for expanding human operations throughout dimensional space." The graduation ceremony was attended by representatives from intelligence agencies, whose existence was classified, military personnel who specialized in theoretical operations that weren't acknowledged in any public forum, and observers whose origins were not entirely human. The pilots who graduated represented the first generation of human military personnel, who were qualified to operate in dimensional space and coordinate with intelligence that existed on scales that transcended individual consciousness. "Major Volkov," Blackwood said as she presented the Dimensional Space Operations qualification insignia, "you and your squadron have earned the distinction of being the first human pilots to successfully complete the evaluation process and qualify for integration into dimensional space operations. Your service has secured humanity's place in the community of intelligence that operates throughout dimensional space." The insignia was unlike anything in conventional military heraldry. It incorporated symbols that seemed to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, representing the pilot's qualification to operate in spaces that existed outside normal physics and coordinate with intelligence that operated on scales beyond current human understanding. "The future of human military operations," Torres said during the ceremony, "will be fundamentally different from anything we've experienced before. We'll be operating in dimensional space, using technology that can affect reality on scales that transcend individual planetary concerns, and coordinating with intelligence that exists throughout the universe." The ceremony concluded with a demonstration flight that showcased the capabilities of the new Dimensional Space Operations Program. The aircraft executed maneuvers that seemed to defy physics, operated in spaces that existed alongside normal reality but followed different rules, and demonstrated tactical capabilities that required thinking in terms that transcended normal three-dimensional space. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hawthorne announced as the demonstration concluded, "you have just witnessed the future of human military aviation. The pilots you've seen today represent the first generation of human military personnel who are qualified to operate in dimensional space and coordinate with intelligence that exists on scales beyond our current understanding." The program that had begun with the mysterious disappearance of 3 pilots in 1987 had evolved into a comprehensive training initiative that prepared human military forces for operations that existed at the intersection of technology and consciousness. The missing pilots had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, learning to operate in dimensional space, understanding the concerns of intelligence that existed on scales beyond human comprehension, and developing the skills necessary to serve as intermediaries between human military forces and evaluation protocols that could determine the future of human technological development. The evaluation process, Blackwood explained to the assembled personnel, was designed to determine whether humanity was ready for integration into dimensional space operations. The successful completion of this process has earned our species the right to participate in activities that affect the very fabric of reality. The implications extended far beyond military aviation. The technology that had been developed during the 40-year secret program would eventually be integrated into civilian applications, leading to advances in transportation, communication, and energy production that would fundamentally transform human civilization. The missing pilots had not only secured humanity's place in the dimensional space community, they had opened the door to technological development that would affect every aspect of human society. "Major," Voss said as the ceremony concluded, "the program we've established here will serve as the foundation for human operations throughout dimensional space. The skills you've learned, the experience you've gained, and the relationships you've developed with non-human intelligence will be essential for guiding humanity's integration into the larger community of intelligence that operates throughout the universe." The missing pilots had returned, but they had brought with them more than just advanced aircraft and theoretical knowledge. They had brought the keys to humanity's future, the protocols for cooperation with intelligence that existed on scales beyond current human understanding, and the foundation for technological development that would affect the very fabric of reality. "The sky," Blackwood said as she looked up at the aircraft that continued to demonstrate capabilities that seemed to exist decades ahead of current technology, "is no longer the limit. It's just the beginning." The program that had begun with 3 missing pilots and mysterious radar contacts had evolved into something that would reshape human understanding of aviation, technology, and consciousness itself. The evaluation process had been completed successfully, and humanity had earned its place in the dimensional space community. The future of human military operations would be fundamentally different from anything that had come before, involving capabilities that existed at the intersection of technology and consciousness, using aircraft that could affect the very fabric of reality. The missing pilots were no longer missing. They had become the foundation for humanity's next evolutionary step, the bridge between current human capabilities and the vast community of intelligence that operated throughout dimensional space. Their 40 years of isolation had been preparation for this moment, when humanity would join the ranks of species that had successfully passed the evaluation process and earned the right to participate in activities that affected the very fabric of reality. "Welcome," came the familiar non-human communication, forming in the consciousness of every pilot who had participated in the evaluation process, "to the dimensional space community. Your species has demonstrated the wisdom and capability necessary for integration into our operations. The universe is much larger than you have imagined, and you are now ready to explore it. The communication faded, but the implications remained. Humanity had passed the test, earned its place in the dimensional space community, and gained access to technology that would fundamentally transform human civilization. The missing pilots had completed their mission, serving as intermediaries between human military forces and intelligence that existed on scales beyond current human understanding. Their call signs, Wraith, Phantom, and Echo, would be remembered as the foundation for humanity's integration into the vast community of intelligence that operated throughout dimensional space. The story that had begun with mysterious radar contacts and impossible aircraft had become something much larger. It was the story of humanity's evaluation, the process by which a species earned the right to participate in activities that affected the very fabric of reality. The missing pilots had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, and their success had secured humanity's place in the dimensional space community. The evaluation is complete, Blackwood announced as the program reached its conclusion. Humanity has been accepted into the dimensional space community, and the future of human technological development has been secured. The missing pilots have completed their mission, and the next phase of human evolution has begun. The aircraft that had once been impossible were now the foundation for humanity's future. The pilots who had been missing for 40 years had become the bridge between current human capabilities and the vast community of intelligence that operated throughout dimensional space. Their story had become humanity's story, the tale of a species that had successfully passed the evaluation process and earned the right to participate in activities that affected the very fabric of reality. The sky was no longer the limit. It was just the beginning of humanity's journey into dimensional space, guided by pilots who had spent 40 years preparing for this moment and intelligence that existed on scales beyond current human understanding. The future of human civilization had been secured, and the next chapter of human evolution was ready to begin.